My wife, Lynn, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She's always been the no nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. Um, I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips. Geez, Lynn, I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. You scared the shit out of me. She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird and just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved her and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home, she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, I'll admit it. Not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep, or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. What was that about last night? I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. You were peeking at me again, from over there, I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me, she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. You creep me the fuck out sometimes. You know that? I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even, she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly. just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth was she doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank, and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home, and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago, things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in two black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was fucking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you, but joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. "What the fuck, Lynn?" I snapped. "This shit is getting really fucking annoying." I A moan, louder than before, reached my ears, and this time I could pinpoint its origin. Moving almost mechanically, I turned my head toward the closet door and found my wife peering through the narrow opening. Her eyes were as wide as I'd ever seen them, and her jaw hung slack in a horrid, cavernous smile. The sight robbed me of speech. I couldn't even muster a scream. Her hands were clenched against her chest, her entire body trembling as if the sheer thrill of the moment was overwhelming. A ragged, rasping moan poured from her throat, low and raw, sending a chill through every nerve in my body. I'm not sure how I did it, but I forced myself to yank open the bathroom door. Without thinking twice, I sprinted downstairs, my bare feet pounding the floor, my hands snatching up keys and phone from a table as I bolted outside. Behind me, I heard her shrill laughter echo through the halls, but not her footsteps. I didn't pause to close the front door. Instead, I tore away in my car, driving faster than I had any right to, the cold air and my own terror making me shake. I was still in nothing but boxers, my hair damp, my skin prickling in the night air. I headed straight to my brother Chris's place, about a 40-minute drive. The entire way, I refused to check my phone. When I finally parked, I glanced at it. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a stream of messages, all sounding puzzled and asking why I had left so suddenly. My anger flared. How could she pretend everything was fine? I hurled my phone at the dashboard. Chris and his wife were astonished when I showed up half-dressed and distressed, but they offered me a place to stay. Chris gave me clothes and asked what happened. I admitted that Lynn and I had argued, but I kept most details private. I didn't want him thinking I'd abandoned my wife over a practical joke, even if it was the most bizarre, unsettling prank I'd ever encountered. I had wanted her to be more lighthearted, not this. Trying to sleep on their couch was impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her face lurking in that closet as if she had always been there. She'd never really left the bathroom. She'd only slipped into hiding. The idea twisted my stomach. I lay awake, wrestling with panic, until Chris gave me a sleeping pill. My sleep was troubled, filled with nightmares of her smiling face hovering inches away. I woke at dawn with stiff muscles and a throbbing head. I realized I had to call Lynn eventually, but I had no clue what I would say. I couldn't return home unless she promised, absolutely and sincerely, that she would never behave like that again. I yearned for the old Lynn, the sensible, serious woman I married. Now that version of her seemed like a dream. I considered calling her to demand normalcy, but then I felt it. That sensation of being watched. My heart twisted. I was flat on my back, staring at the ceiling, but fear rooted me in place. The longer I avoided looking around, the heavier it weighed on me. My eyes drifted downward despite my reluctance. There, pressed close to the window, was Lynn's face again. She gazed inside with that same unsettling grin, saliva trailing down the glass in long, shiny lines. I didn't know how long she'd been watching me. The idea that she might have stood there all night made my blood run cold. I didn't scream, though my pulse hammered in my ears. Anger outweighed my fear now. I jumped up and slapped a hand against the window, my voice rising. "Lynn, have you lost your mind? Go home now!" I shouted. She didn't budge. Her demented grin seemed to grow even more joyous. I could hear Chris and Rebecca stirring upstairs. As if Lynn heard them as well, I noticed her head twitch toward the sound. Slowly, her mouth began to close. Chris called out my name, worry coloring his tone. I turned to acknowledge him and Rebecca rushing down. But when I looked back to the window, Lynn had vanished, leaving only those twin streaks of drool as proof she'd ever been there. I tried to explain what I'd seen to Chris and Rebecca, but they were doubtful. Who wouldn't be? They followed me outside to the spot under the window, but we found no footprints, no sign of her presence, just a slight depression in the soil. Chris decided it must have been an animal. Exhausted and shaken, I didn't argue. I skipped work that day and powered down my phone. Facing Lynn directly was too daunting. I truly believed something had gone horribly wrong with her, that she'd changed in a way that couldn't be undone. The realization broke my heart. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I resolved to at least give her one last chance to explain herself after 6 years of marriage. I switched my phone back on and saw countless texts from her, all sounding concerned, worried, loving, nothing that acknowledged the horror I'd experienced. The discrepancy unsettled me more than anything else. We talk. I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. Message after message echoed the same theme. She loved me. She wanted me back. She was concerned. Not a single one acknowledged the unsettling behavior I'd witnessed, as though she hadn't been acting like a character straight out of a horror novel. Even her texts felt off. She normally wrote long, detailed messages just to ask me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she would have more to say after the strange, unnerving things she'd done. I know it might sound childish to some of you, reading this from a distance. But if you had seen the way Lynn looked at me, how she scurried away on all fours, like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet as though it was the most natural thing in the world, you might understand why I reacted as I did. I ended up spending another night at Chris and Rebecca's place. I slept in late the next day, and thankfully, there was no sign of Lynn peering at me through the window. I don't mean to pry, but is there any chance this disagreement can be resolved? Rebecca asked around lunchtime. She had made sandwiches for both of us, and I could tell she wanted to approach the subject gently. I'm not sure. She's just not herself, I said cautiously. I still wasn't ready for Rebecca or Chris to know the full extent of the unsettling situation I'd been dealing with. People change, Ben, but she's still the same woman you married, deep down. Maybe you two just need to talk things through. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the optimist. I think it's gone too far. I'm not sure talking would help. I just don't trust her anymore, I admitted. The words hurt. I missed my wife and still loved her. But how could I live with someone who frightened me like this? Constantly feeling on edge wasn't something I could endure. Lynn loves you. She must be absolutely heartbroken, Rebecca said quietly. I'm not so sure about that, I replied. Well, she certainly seemed distraught to me. I've never seen her so upset, very unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to truly sink in, and when they did, an uneasy feeling crept over me. Wait, what do you mean? You saw her? You actually saw Lynn? I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded as if it were no big deal. Perhaps to her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning, just after Chris left for work, she said, clearing the dishes. I didn't see her car, though. Maybe she took a rideshare or something. Rebecca, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, my palms starting to sweat. I found myself glancing around the room, suddenly on alert, as if something might be lurking in the corners. No, she just asked if you were awake yet. I said you weren't. I offered to wake you, but she said no. She just told me to let you sleep, Rebecca explained, washing the plates. That's it? She didn't say anything else? I pressed. No, she looked terrible, though, like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her, Rebecca said. I got up and thanked her for lunch. I felt a slight relief knowing that Lynn hadn't actually come inside. Still, I needed to double-check the locks. I sat on the couch for a while, trying to figure out my next move. I didn't want to go home, but I felt I owed Lynn my help if I could give it. Didn't I promise to love and cherish her in sickness and in health? Clearly, something was very wrong with her. If she was ill, which I truly believed, I had to figure out how to get her the help she needed. But where to start? The idea of calling the police felt wrong. What would I even say to them? That my wife was lurking around, acting strangely and frightening me? As unsettling as her behavior had been, she hadn't broken any laws. Not yet, anyway. The police would likely think I was overreacting. But this wasn't some harmless prank. It felt dangerous, as if something dark lay beneath her smile. I heard a faint, shaky intake of breath, as though she was struggling to maintain her composed exterior. Marianne, what's Roe? I began, but she cut me off. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice is to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. Before I could say another word, she hung up. I tried to understand her refusal to help. Even if she disliked me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? It made no sense. I went over the conversation in my head, desperate to find some hidden clue. After a long time, I almost gave up. Then I remembered her last words. Seek professional help. She had said them with a slight urgency. Maybe I was grasping at straws, but I was certain her tone had shifted, as if those words held deeper significance. What did she mean? Perhaps she really did mean medical professionals. Or maybe someone else, someone she couldn't mention. Or maybe I was simply desperate. When Chris came home, I had a long, exhausting talk with him and Rebecca. I told them about the most recent encounter, how Lynn had hidden, peeking at me from the closet. They were shocked, but believed me. They wanted to help, but they didn't seem to grasp the severity. To them, it was unsettling, maybe a strange prank. Rebecca even half-jokingly suggested Lynn might be making videos for the internet. Chris insisted we not involve the police yet. He thought talking calmly with Lynn, coaxing her into getting help, would be best. I agreed, relieved not to face her alone. This morning, after breakfast, we drove to my house. I refused to go after dark. My stomach churned as we parked. Her car was gone, but I didn't relax. The front door was slightly open, and for a moment I imagined her eyes behind it. My hands shook, and I began to sweat. Chris seemed calm, hands in his pockets, as though taking a casual walk. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and immediately recoiled. A foul odor hit me. Chris smelled it too and followed me in, wrinkling his nose. "What do you clean the floors with around here?" he muttered, voice strained, trying to lighten the mood. "Quiet," I said, my eyes scanning every shadow for any sign of Lynn. The house was unnervingly quiet and dim, even though it was mid-morning. All the curtains were drawn, preventing any natural light from seeping in. If I hadn't known I'd left just 2 days before, I would have assumed the place had been long abandoned. We moved through each room carefully, checking any spot where she might be hiding. We called her name occasionally, but there was no response. "Why are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked at one point, sounding bewildered. "We're searching for your wife, right?" He shot me a baffled look. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me. We headed up to check the bathroom and the spare bedroom. As we climbed the stairs, my shoes crunched over scattered shards of glass. I realized one of our wedding portraits, which hung along the staircase, had been shattered. The frame tilted at an awkward angle, its glass gone. I paused, a lump forming in my throat as I stared at the photo. It had been taken right after our vows. She had looked so beautiful, so radiant. It was impossible to imagine that same face now sending chills down my spine. We finished checking the spare room. Nothing had been disturbed. Then we approached the bathroom. I hesitated, the memory of that awful night rushing back. Chris noticed and offered to go in first, but I insisted we go together. We looked in the closet and shower. Everything was as I had left it. "I don't think she's here, Ben," Chris said. "Why don't you pack some clothes and we can come back tomorrow?" I nodded, relieved for the suggestion. In our bedroom, I threw some clothes into a duffel bag. That's when I noticed the terrible odor intensifying. I opened the closet and the source of the smell made me gag. Chris took one glance inside, then backed away into the hallway, his face pale. He had to stand near the stairs to escape the stench. Inside the closet, carefully arranged, were dozens of small objects that made my stomach twist. I won't describe them in detail. Their presence alone was horrifying. I forced myself to shut the door and step back into the hall, taking deep breaths to steady myself. The smell seemed to cling to my tongue, and I fought the urge to retch. "Who lines up?" "Things like that," Chris muttered, trying to understand but clearly unsettled. "I tried to tell you she needed help," I managed to say quietly. "This goes beyond help, Ben," he whispered, looking sickened. "We should leave. I can't handle this smell any longer." His words cut off abruptly, Visley, and his eyes widened in fear. I didn't need to ask why. I felt it too, a presence, someone watching us. I slowly turned around, my gaze sweeping the bedroom until I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, was my wife. Her hands were clasped beneath her chin, trembling with what seemed like excitement. Now that she'd been discovered, I could hear a quiet, hiccup-like sound coming from her throat, as though she was overwhelmed by some strange joy. Her eyes were wide and that unsettling grin stretched across her face. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I resisted. This was still my wife, no matter how changed. I had to try to reach her. "Lynn," I said gently. She didn't speak, but she bobbed her head slightly as if acknowledging me. "Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?" I took a small step forward as though approaching a frightened animal. "I love you, Lynn." I moved closer. She let out a tiny, strained sound. Her eyes grew even wider, her shoulders quivering. I crouched down to see her better and gasped quietly. Her hands were smeared with something dark, and the closer I got, the more I realized how tense and trembling she was. It took all my strength not to recoil at the scent and the sight. Her lips were cracked and dry, and she seemed barely in control of herself. "Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding," I asked softly. She nodded again, her fingers twitching as though playing invisible keys. When I tried to reach for her hand, she suddenly lashed out. I felt a sharp pain, and I fell back with a cry. My arm burned, and I could see a fresh red stain spreading on my sleeve. I looked up in shock. She was clutching a jagged shard of glass, smiling wildly. Chris called from behind me, asking if I was all right. I managed a nod, cradling my wounded arm. When I turned back, Lynn's focus was no longer on me. She was staring past me at Chris, her smile replaced by a harsh, angry glare. I stood up and backed slowly down the hallway, unwilling to turn my back on her. Chris, at the top of the stairs, looked terrified. The moment he spoke, Lynn lunged forward, crawling out from under the bed with alarming speed. "Chris, run!" I shouted. He didn't move at first, but then I pushed him toward the stairs. Lynn emerged fully, standing in the doorway, her posture tense and threatening, that shard of glass still in her fist. She tilted her head, her mouth opening wider than seemed natural, as if grinning at our fear. Chris whispered a prayer, then bolted down the stairs. I hesitated, heart torn between love and survival, but when Lynn sprinted toward me, I turned and fled. I leapt down the steps 2 or 3 at a time, reaching the front door just as I felt her leap onto my back. She wrapped her arms around my neck, making strange, hiccuping sounds right by my ear. I wrenched free, knocking her to the floor, feeling a stinging pain in my back as I went. I didn't look back. I flung open the door and ran to my car. Chris was already outside, calling the police. I jumped into the driver's seat and Chris followed, still on the line with the dispatcher. As we sped away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see her chasing us. But she never appeared. I went straight to the emergency room where I received stitches for my injuries. The police questioned us thoroughly and went back to the house, but of course, Lynn was gone. They advised me to stay with friends or family and to consider a restraining order. I knew, somehow, it wouldn't matter. After dropping Chris off, I drove an hour away and checked into a motel, trying to put as much distance as possible between Lynn and myself. I've been here about 4 hours. I hoped maybe the police would find her and get her help. But about 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you." Attached was a grainy, dark photo, but I recognized it immediately. My wife's eye staring right at me. I started typing this after I received the text. I'm alone, frightened, and I can't shake the sensation of being watched, even now.